Okay, this takes up with immediate background part 3. We're taking directly up where the last video left off. The colonies have celebrated the repeal of the Stamp Act, which, if they had anything to do with that, it would be the economic pressure they brought by non-importation or a comprehensive boycott against British products imported into the colonies. Two more parting shots on that, both important. To help enforce the boycott, to put pressure on people who didn't take it seriously or merchants who still wanted to stock British merchandise, colonists began to get organized. I think the first one was in Boston, of course, copied later in other colonial cities, groups of young men calling themselves Sons of Liberty. Typically, they would be apprentices, dock workers, people like that, would do the work, led from deep cover by prominent businessmen such as Samuel Adams, John Hancock, people like that. So these people are going to be present from then on. There's another thing here. Our case against the Stamp Act or British taxation here had a hole in it big enough to sail a ship through. Okay, interested? The fact is, Britain had taxed us before. Remember the Molasses Act. It was on the books for, 33 years? They took that away and set up the Sugar Act. These are popular names. The technical names would be longer. And we had evaded the taxes. We'd bribed the tax collectors. We'd smuggled the molasses. We'd got around any way we could, except one. It never crossed anybody's mind to protest those taxes. Now, one thing about the way the English common law system works is that if some practice that's not the subject of a statutory legislation or something passed by legislature, if it goes on unprotested long enough, then it becomes legal. That's just how it is. So we couldn't just get up one morning and start protesting taxes when we had allowed taxes in the past without protesting them. So this was going to be a hard sell for British leaders whom we hope to persuade to do away with the taxes through legal argument. It ain't going to work. All right? So what we had to do, still bound by the requirements of logical consistency, we got over that, was to show some very important difference, a significant difference, to show that the Stamp Act was significantly different from earlier taxes that we had not protested. And here's what we came up with. Okay? We alleged that whereas the Molasses Act and the Sugar Act were external taxes, meaning there are two main characteristics there, they were not meant to raise revenue for the British government, when in fact the Sugar Act was, and that their purpose was regulating trade within the empire, not raising revenue. Those were okay. We'd rather not say that, but there's this little thing about logical consistency. Whereas that, they were external taxes, the Stamp Act is an internal tax. The old taxes are only paid by merchants when ships are getting ready to be unloaded. Okay, taking up where the last one, it just stopped recording the video and kept recording the audio, so this can be patched together. Maybe you can tell, maybe you can't. But the problem is we have we've let taxes go unprotested before. So we try to draw this brand new, never before seen under the sun distinction between external taxes, which we feel like we have to concede are okay. We won't protest those, and internal taxes where we draw the line. Internal taxes are collected within a colony. Every time you buy a newspaper, file a document, write a letter to your girlfriend, you're having to pay a tax. And they are meant to raise revenue for the British government. Now, we couldn't sell that. British leaders, it's not that they didn't understand what they were saying, they just rejected our argument. So we taxed us before, we can tax you now. It's just how it is. So you can't fix that. You cannot fix that. The whole concept of representation had changed. So anyway, the Stamp Act is done, and then things calm down a bit. Over in Britain, the king has got rid of George Grenville, replaced him for about a year with someone known as the Marquis of Rockingham. And one more little thing. Okay, the Stamp Act was obviously a failure before it was repealed, but the men who set it up could not take it down. I think the Orientals call that loss of face. Okay? You cannot admit that your policies have been a failure. So once they're gone, they can't take it down. The new guys can. So the Rockingham government repealed the Stamp Act, passed the Declaratory Act, because they didn't have the same political investment in it. Okay, in 1767, I think it was, the king brought back a man who had been in a high position earlier. I don't know whether he'd been prime minister or not. I always thought he was. I've now learned maybe he wasn't. William Pitt, largely responsible for winning the French and Indian War. William Pitt was made prime minister. Pitt was not an old man, but he was not a well man. William Pitt suffered from geezer diseases when he was still not that old. He had gout, he had kidney stones, etc. And he didn't think he could take the physical pounding that presiding daily over the House of Commons would inflict. So he asked of the king and received a promotion to the House of Lords. The king elevated him to the peerage, as they call it, making him the Earl of Chatham. So he's the prime minister, but he's not doing what the prime minister normally does, which is presiding over the House of Commons. That left other ministers in the government, members of the House, to try their hand at steering the ship. A man named Charles Townshend came up with a new approach for taxing the colonists. Townshend held the title of, or the job of, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Read for that, Secretary of the Treasury. And his approach was this to the colonists. You don't mind external taxes? You'll pay those? Okay, here are 5 new external taxes we're sure you will not mind paying. And they placed import duties on 5 items: lead, glass, tea, paper, and paint, specifically artist colors. Who thought that up? Now, the one of those that might have made the red light come on your dashboard was tea. All right? So the Townshend duties, a duty being a tax on imported goods, as in you brought something in from some other country duty-free, that's how that meaning of the word, they go into effect in 1767. The projection of revenue was wildly optimistic, but there's not as much protest this time. For one thing, they are clearly legal. We don't like them, but they're legal. You know, they line up with what we'd been saying before. Plus, for the aristocracy, such as we had in the colonies, they'd gotten a little bit antsy about all this protest stuff. They're just uncertain about where that might be heading. That if that got out of hand, that could flare up into a general bonfire that would burn down the whole social structure. You're just not willing to take that risk. So it's not much protest at first. But these taxes were in effect for 3 years until 1770, and resistance mounted as time went on. At first, there were suggestions for a targeted boycott aimed at just the 5 items. And whereas the Stamp Act boycott had approached 100% effectiveness, the Townshend duties boycott of maybe about 50% effectiveness by 1770. This was the moment when the British customs agents seized a ship belonging to John Hancock named the Liberty. This has huge psychological significance, and mob violence flared up. Some of the British tax collectors got roughed up and had to flee for protection to a British warship anchored in the harbor. So they didn't think they could do their jobs without military protection, which they requested and received from the British government. In 1768, 2 regiments, roughly 1,000 men, were transferred from, I think, Halifax, Nova Scotia, down to Boston. So now we are stationing British troops in Boston. I have to lay out the scene here. You won't find this if you go up there today, but Boston, for its first couple of centuries, was built on an irregularly shaped peninsula thrusting from west to east into Boston Harbor, surrounded mostly by water, connected to the mainland by a narrow, low-lying isthmus the locals called the Neck. So it's an enclosed space. Now, nobody likes this. Local people don't like this. The British troops are nervous. The first 2 or 3 officers assigned to command them, by the next day, they'd be writing letters wanting a transfer because they could tell a bad situation when they saw one. So we have British troops in Boston, and that starts to raise the temperature. Meanwhile, a Pennsylvania lawyer named John Dickinson, writing as, you didn't use your name, you get in trouble, writing as the farmer in Pennsylvania, started writing letters, op-ed pieces, which were plagiarized all up and down the eastern seaboard. There were 12 of them in all, letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. Dickinson had a way of translating complex legal issues into easily understandable dirt-level arguments. He's definitely having effect. So let me see where I'm at. I'm going to leave the next thing that's a very dramatic thing that happened in March 1770, the Boston Massacre. Hard to separate fact from fiction. I'll give you the story as I understand it in the next installment.